So the issue of free speech has been a big deal lately, and it is a big deal. And we should make a big deal about it, and everybody needs to be making a big deal about it. And I've been listening very carefully to all the arguments about what should we do, what should we do. They're banning conservatives, they're banning everybody from all platforms. It's getting ridiculous, and I think we all know this is what's going on. We're just not sure of what to do, and everybody seems to have a different opinion about what do we need to do, what do we need to do. So I found this video that I think tells us exactly what we need to do. And before I put the video on, I want to talk about his argument that I totally agree with. So many people have said, well, we're conservatives, therefore we can't pass a law regulating business. Well, this is just nonsense. That whole argument is just totally and completely nonsense. All we have to do is pass a law saying that free speech applies everywhere, including business. And I say this because allowing or making sure that free speech applies to business does not interfere with any business whatsoever. That's a ridiculous argument to say, oh, you can't tell us how to run our business. We're not telling you how to run your business. You can run your business. Free speech does not interfere in the slightest with how anyone runs their business. How someone talks is not in the slightest anything to do with how you run your business or how anyone runs their business. Free speech is free speech. It's guaranteed in our Constitution. It should be guaranteed within a business environment as much as anywhere else. And to say that it's not guaranteed within a business environment just violates the whole concept of free speech. That's just plain stupid. And I'm tired of hearing people make that argument. Free speech is free speech. We should be allowed to say whatever we want within any environment we want to say it, as long as we're not harming anyone else. As long as we're not advocating violence or advocating harm to someone, we should be allowed free speech. And for a business to try to tell us that we can't have our right to free speech is just nonsense. This is particularly true in this day and age when business owns the common square. And that's what's going on right now. The business owns the internet. Business regulates the internet. Business has total control over the internet. And yet we all know that the internet is the new common square. And therefore, we have to extend the law to business. I'm sorry, but it's just ridiculous to say anything else. And to hear a really good argument about why this is so and what we need to do, I suggest you watch the following video. That I highly, highly recommend it and would advocate that everyone watch this video and that everyone share this video. It's really important. We have got to start standing up for free speech and not allowing private companies to tell us what we can and cannot say. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. It's ignorant. And if we don't start doing it and start doing it now, we're going to lose our free speech. So here's the video. Enjoy.
Today, I think what we realized, if you hadn't realized it already, no sound? Hold on, give me a moment. Yeah, should have sound. In any event, at least it's not a government. Okay. Everybody hear me? That's good. The Google tape is revelatory because it's not just what's happening in Google. Like, does anybody really doubt meaningfully that the scene that played out inside Google on that tape with executives bawling their eyes out over the victory of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton's loss, does anybody doubt that that also happened inside of Facebook and Twitter? Maybe not in one giant setting. Perhaps not. Perhaps the executives of Facebook and Twitter were more responsible in the sense that they didn't have a giant meeting where they all bawled their eyes out. Instead, I'm sure that happened behind closed doors where they all did that. Those are the people in that room, the people who are utterly traumatized and rendered helpless and pathetic by Hillary Clinton's loss. Those are the people that regulate your speech. They already do. Right? You say, well, no, I have free speech. Okay, interesting. Right? Maybe your speech isn't regulated if you're just somebody with a few hundred followers who just wants to say something to a few people. But if you're someone with an audience that you've built up over time on social media, which is many people who aren't already famous, then your speech is regulated by Google, Facebook, and Twitter. Because if those three companies decide that you don't get a voice, then you can be removed from the internet. This is why I was so strongly upset about the Alex Jones banning. Not because I was particularly a huge fan of Alex Jones, because of what that represented. The collective work of four companies with a combined market cap of nearly $3 trillion deciding you no longer have a place on the internet. And that's the scariest thing about it. So these companies are already reviewing their speech. And it's funny because the very same day I saw on National Review published an op-ed by Kevin Williamson, he who was briefly hired by The Atlantic and then fired. Jacob Wohl says this should be worked out in the courts, not through brand new government bureaucracy. I'm going to address that right now. Like, I literally got that reply on Twitter. I will straight up address it as though it were a comment on Twitter. Jacob says it should be worked out in the courts. What law are the courts applying? You say. Well, you say courts should apply existing law to solve the problem of big tech censorship. Okay, well, let's try antitrust law. Might work, could happen. Might solve the problem 4 years from now, maybe. And that's if we don't lose the question of whether these companies are monopolies in the first place, which we might, right? Like, there's no existing court ruling saying that Google and Facebook and Twitter are monopolies. That's one question. Second question, are they actually engaging in anti-competitive behavior under the Sherman Antitrust Act? Right? That's the second question if you say we just need to work with antitrust. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe that's not. Right? Like, any competitive behavior in the past has been focused on trying to undercut your competitors and prevent them from making a profit. That's not what Facebook and Twitter are doing here that we find so objectionable. Right? What we find objectionable is the fact that they're using their monopoly power not to undercut their competitors, but for political ends. That's something antitrust law wasn't designed for, and so it's not written to solve that problem. So maybe if you tried to put in place a system, maybe if you tried to pursue antitrust litigation, it might work. Maybe you could convince a judge or some appellate judges or the entire Supreme Court that what Google and Facebook and Twitter are doing violates antitrust law when it comes to censoring conservatives. But what if you don't? Are you just going to wait 5 years and then find out, oh, well, current law actually doesn't solve that problem? That seems like a very unwise thing to me. It seems like a very unwise solution to the problem. When I say regulate big tech, I mean this. New law. We need new law. We need law to come into force, brand new law, that is directly on point, that says big social media companies and big search companies can't censor and discriminate against conservative content. So Jeremy says, I don't see a political solution to this. Now, maybe what I'm asking for is politically impossible. Who knows? But I know this. We need to be trying for it. We need to be pushing for it. We need to be making it the civil rights cause of the Republican Party, right? Civil rights seemed impossible for Democrats to get passed. I mean, if you want to read about that, read the biographies of Lyndon Johnson. They're excellent, and as well as the history of civil rights legislation. Like, it seemed impossible because of the nature of the filibuster rules. But they passed new laws, right? They said, no, you know what? Yes, there's existing law that people are violating. Yes, we can win cases in the courts of the 14th Amendment, but you know what? We need new law that solves the problem. Like, that was the attitude of the legislators. They're like, yes, we're going to work through the courts and get things like Brown versus Board of Education. We're going to get court rulings that, help the cause of civil rights, but we're also going to pass new laws that directly target the fundamental problem. And they pass civil rights laws, and they change the world. We can do the same thing. You don't need to create a new agency. Existing agencies are fine. What you need to do is write law that is specifically targeted to solve the problem that we've identified, right? Write new law. That's on point. That there's no doubt about what the companies have to do, whether or not they'll be found liable. That solves the problem today. It doesn't solve it 5 years from now, right? These companies won't clearly violate law, newly written law that directly targets them and is unquestionable about what it means. That's what you need to do. That's what we need to do as a movement. The objection to new law is, I think, very weak, right? And I mean, honestly, like, again, somebody, as Homeschool USA says, what other choices left? They must be regulated. Somebody says, well, you can compete with them yourself. You can build your own Google, internet search provider, social media companies, heck, internet service providers, why not? I don't think that's a really good option, personally. I think it's pretty obvious that they're monopolies in their own way. And I want you to, the people who haven't thought hard about this problem, somebody says the companies will just move offshore and say that the law doesn't apply. Jacob, that's not how American law works. You want to operate on American soil even if you're in a foreign country? You got to operate and abide by United States law. Like, imagine for a second that you were trying to make this argument, Jacob, about a foreign corporation that was violating American civil rights law and discriminating on the basis of race. You realize that would not work, right? That would not work. If you write new law that says if you serve United States citizens, you may not discriminate against on the basis of political censorship, and if you do that, you will be held liable in American courts, guess what? They're going to do it. This idea that we can't enforce law against corporations, I don't know. I mean, I feel like the thing is conservatives have this fundamental bias, right? It's like, and it's understandable because we were taught by the Koch Institute. Jacob, you say offshore hedge. Jacob, you were talking to a lawyer. Do you realize what my credentials are? Offshore hedge funds still have to operate within the rules of the United States financial system. They do, right? Like, now it can be challenging to get jurisdiction over them, but like, that's because offshore hedge funds are different. They can make a claim to be only operating within their particular country. Google and Facebook operate in the entire United States. There's no way they could just evade US jurisdiction. Jacob, you are wrong. You are a 21-year-old who has not gone to law school. Stop arguing with a lawyer about law. Jesus Christ, dude. Like, wake up. You are talented in your area. This is not your area of expertise. David, as David points out, Google is fined by the EU. You think Google can just not obey EU law because it's an American company? Like, of course Google has to comply with EU law. How did I get off track? Anyway, obviously, writing new law is the way to do this. Moreover, if, Jacob, your original solution was to take them to the courts, why do you think that the courts would then be able to indict them if somehow they were just able to move offshore and evade the court rulings, right? There's no reason that your logic about this offshore, evasion problem wouldn't apply to court rulings under existing law and not to new law. Like, very frustrating. Anyway, we need to write new law. These are the people who are regulating your speech already. Google regulates your speech today. Twitter regulates your speech today. Facebook regulates your speech today. And the question of, like, do you just let them do that? Do you let a room full of 20 Democrats decide who gets to be on the internet and who doesn't? Do you think that that's an acceptable outcome for the conservative political movement? I think it's obviously not. I think it's obviously not. People who Jacob needs to agree to disagree. Listen to the other commenters, Jacob. I don't mean to. I'm not trying not to be mean, but I'm just like, you are simply wrong on this question. Somebody says, but if a gay baker can refuse service to a Christian, can't Twitter regulate content? Well, a few points. One, it's not obvious that a gay baker can refuse service to a Christian. Two, there's the reason that a Christian would potentially be able to get out of the force of civil rights law is because there's a thing called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that uniquely protects exercises of religious freedom. That's a reason that in other contexts you obviously can't violate civil rights law. Like, that same person couldn't deny service to somebody because they're black. The only reason there's this potential possibility that they could deny service to somebody because they're gay is because Congress has passed a statute called the RFRA that trumps civil rights law. There's no such thing that comes into play with that for censorship. Somebody says, don't tell my business who I must serve. Well, here's the thing, Trent. I mean, do you think you should be able to not serve black people? I think you should be at basis of race. I'm kind of done with the sort of Goldwater-esque thing. And the reason I say that is because if you read the history of civil rights law, you'll recognize there's a really powerful story in Lyndon Johnson's, the biographies of Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson was a nasty human, don't get me wrong. But here's the story. Lyndon Johnson had an old car he really liked that he wanted driven between Washington, D.C. and Texas when he was a senator. And when he had his, the servants at his house was a black servant and would drive that car back and forth. And at one time, like, he seemed like he had a really rough time, and I think Lyndon Johnson asked, like, why was the trip bad? And he's like, yeah, I wasn't able to stop at a bathroom for like a 500-mile stretch because none of them would accept black people. None of the motels would accept black people. So I had to get off on the side of the road and take a shit. That's what people had to do before civil rights law, right? That's how black people were treated in the South before civil rights law. And you know what? Like, property rights are great, but at a certain point, it wasn't wrong for the government to say, you know what? That's over, right? We're not doing that anymore. You guys are serving people, regardless of the color of their skin. Republicans, while not obviously nothing of even on the magnitude of what blacks were facing in the South, are facing potentially a very similar civil rights question in this sense. People who are deeply hostile to us have a monopoly over a particular important function in the world. It's not common carrier rules, but it's the ability to communicate in the public square. Our political adversaries control the digital public square. We control the government. The question is, will you let your principles of letting your progressives control access to the digital public square stop you from doing what is necessary to make it possible for Republicans to win? I think that's stupid. I think that's self-defeating. What was one of Alinsky's rules? Make your opponent live up to their own book of rules. What do Democrats want us to do? They want us to live up to our own book of rules. You never intervene in a private company. That's what they think the rule should be. I think we should adopt a different perspective. I think we should look to the Republican history of people like Teddy Roosevelt, who recognized the potential pitfalls of excessive corporate power and the importance of ultimately the government being a stopgap to ensure the corporations don't have too much of it. Wanda says, what about taking this to the Supreme Court? Well, the Supreme Court will hear a case if it goes through the lower courts first. Moreover, the question is not whether there will be litigation, it's under what law the courts will hear challenges to regulation. Are we regulating on the basis of antitrust? Well, then we might be too far out in front of our skis because antitrust law doesn't give the government the necessary authority to do this. Jacob says corporations are people. They are. I totally agree. They are people. They're just subject to regulation. You're not talking to somebody who doesn't think corporations, that the whole corporate person law is the argument that, like, how dare you say corporations are people? Of course they're people. It's necessary for them to be, legal actors. Right? Like, you're talking to a lawyer. Obviously, corporate person is important. But just like any other people, they can be regulated. Right? So he says, who do you want to control your speech, the U.S. Constitution or big tech? That's another point. That's another point. People say, well, what about, this will be like a fairness doctrine or something. The government is constrained at how it can regulate speech. It can only allow for more of it. It can't allow for less of it. There's a Supreme Court case called Packingham versus North Carolina. The North Carolina legislature, in its wisdom, said that sex offenders shouldn't be able to use social media services in their state. Not unreasonable. I mean, you kind of think sensible, right? Like, in sort of the abstract, I think social media, maybe sex offenders shouldn't be able to use social media. Not unreasonable. Don't want children being targeted by sex offenders on social media. Seems bad. Supreme Court 9-0 decision said can't do that. Can't do that. First Amendment law says the government cannot restrict access to the public square. Social media is the public square. Government can't put in place regulations like that. If the government regulates social media in such a way as to protect the rights of conservatives to express themselves, that won't have a constitutional issue. But if it tries to regulate social media in such a way that restricts conservative speech, unconstitutional under Packingham. Very clearly. 9-0, not even a question. It's not a split. It's not like Heller. It's not like Roe versus Wade, where there's a split decision and you have to worry about being overturned. 9-0 decision says government cannot restrict access to social media. It's settled law. Oh, somebody's getting banned for making roughly anti-Semitic comments. Banned. Somebody says, how come they let Alex Jones die then? I don't know who. I assume you're replying to some other commenter. So he says, why don't you just stay on Gab? Because I don't like just hanging out in a place that only has anti-Semites. It's like the Twitter prison. It's like going to Supermax. Twitter Supermax, right, is Gab, basically. Can he bring a suit? I don't think he has a meaningful cause of action. Because right now, the First Amendment doesn't govern private companies. Of course it doesn't, right? Like, they're private companies. Question is, do you think that as a policy matter, and as a matter of preserving the cultural value of free speech, that companies should be bound by the First Amendment law if they're major big tech companies and have a monopoly over their own social media?
Yes, yes, yes.
Anglosphere has a good job.
Of course we should.
Somebody says Google doesn't care about our liberty, so why should we care about theirs? Back to the original point. You watch that video. Those people hate Trump. And they think Trump voters are motivated by racism and prejudice and bigotry, that they're enabling fascism and communism. That's the kind of person who works at Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Because that's Silicon Valley. That's like where I grew up. I know people there. Trust me. Pretty liberal. Pretty liberal. Do you want those people to be regulating your speech? Because they already do. They have full control over it. Even if you're not currently banned, you're operating with a sword of Damocles created by those people. And they're the ones who decide whether to cut it off or not. Right? Liberals don't get banned. I think it was like wild that Chickarella Maher got banned because he was wishing death upon someone. It takes like that level of abuse to get a lefty banned. So he says, the FTC point is interesting, but I never get my hopes up against the FTC. That's perfectly reasonable, Jacob. I think that, here's my basic perspective, right? Every single avenue should be pursued because the ultimate goal is so important. And losing is just simply not an option, right? Basically allowing a circumstance where big tech is allowed to censor corporate conservative speech willy-nilly is not an acceptable outcome. Because if they're censoring it this bad with Trump in power, imagine how bad it will be if Democrats ever retake power. So, judicial. Obviously, we should pursue judicial challenges under current law, Section 230, right? Going after them for defamation lawsuits, antitrust, you name it, right? All those avenues should be pursued in the courts. Simultaneously, regulatory action. We want to push FCC, FTC, all of them should be like pushed by Trump to go ahead and try and regulate within the lawful bounds and pushing interpretations as much as necessary. Third, pushing legislation that is directly on point, that gives new authority to regulatory agencies to ensure that they do not censor conservatives, right? All three avenues, and public affairs. That's what needs to be done. And if you don't think that, watch that video again and tell me that exactly why it's conservative to let those people regulate your speech. Why it's okay to let those people determine who gets monetized on Google and who doesn't, on YouTube and who doesn't, right? 90% of searches performed by Google. YouTube dominates the video space, right? Determines who can make money off of their speech and who can't, right?
So he just goes on a little bit more with this, and I don't think anybody needs to hear any more of the argument. That's it right there. I mean, the whole thing is, do you believe in free speech or not? If you believe in free speech, then you should believe that free speech applies no matter where you are. It's our law. It's the very foundation of everything American. If you believe in free speech, share this video. Get it out to everyone. Let everybody know that we have got to stand up for our rights.